Hello everyone, welcome to Sahitya Academy's Webline Literature series. Today's program is in English language. There are various types of those who have been watching our channel for last few months. They will be know that we had symposiums, a couple of symposia, and then we have poetry reading, discussions on poetry, panel discussions on speculative Indian literature, etc., etc. And today's program is going to feature very distinguished panel of speakers. They are going to present papers. This program is going to be chaired by Professor Manju, Jakka. And the topic for today's discussion is Diasporic Indian English Literature. And Indian diaspora had a long history from Romani, if we can count them in Europe, to Tamilians in East Asia, before the advent of modern, dawn of modern era. I'm talking about that. So we have chronicles and recording of Bodhisena in Japan. So those group of people, the community, the settlement, they went and settled in Japan, and they even carried a script from India to there. And what happened was, in turn, they even also brought here, or say, I don't know how the communication worked 1500 years ago, I don't know. So what we have is some kind of a remnants, or scatterings of literature that came from Japan, probably 10th or 11th century onwards. And then we have in the modern era, all of you know about how migrant laborers were taken indentured to work as indentured laborers in Caribbean, South Africa, Madagascar, Mauritius, Reunion, and so on. Their history shows not only the travails they endured, but also how they overcame the odds very successfully. As the time went by, their lives took upward graph. They settled down. Generation after generation. Some of them started capturing their struggles, their experiences in paper and pen. So, well, I don't want to take much of your time. So, initially, when we see that it's more towards a acute quest for identity, that's common. That's a very understandable. So nostalgia for roots, a sense of guilt, and how they were exploited in foreign lands, and so on. Basically, it's a longing to return to the roots that dominated the early diaspora literature, whichever language it may be. It may be in Hindi, it may be in English, it may be in Tamil. But as went on, and all of you must be knowing the contemporary time in the last 100 years, not even contemporary. We had Nira, the V.S. Naipaul, Bharti Mukherjee, Anita Desai. They all had belonged to a particular era where they represented some kind of they act as a link, to so to speak, between the medieval times to modern. And then more recently we had Salman Rushdie, Shashi Tharoor, Amitav Ghosh, Vikram Seth, Jimpal Akhri, or Hari Kunzur. I don't know, the list goes on and on and on. And but one thing that has happened is that this particular English diaspora literature, what it done is, it has influenced the way in which the publication production takes place, the commercial success, especially the critical review of the works of these authors just now I mentioned, and much more host of a galaxy of other writers. Actually, it helped Indian literature. One, it put Indian literature on the global map, and two, it helped Indian language publishers to change of their style of production and dissemination. So with these few words, I am very, very happy to welcome all of you. And now I hand over to Professor Manju Jakka. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the very lucid introduction. And I am happy to see that I have some very well-known names out here, people who have been working on the diasporic tradition in Indian writing. We have 5 speakers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 speakers out here, and we have 2.5 hours almost at our disposal. I think it will be fine if you speak for about 15 minutes, extendable by 1 or 2 more minutes. And then we can have a discussion at the end, or we can have it in between after the papers. What would the speakers prefer? Would
I
you
think
like
at
to?
the end is
At the
better.
end, yes.
Fine.
Yeah.
At the end,
Fine.
it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we'll have, so we
Only
begin.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry.
just one point, like I have to leave at 4:30. I'll be traveling. So like while traveling, I may not be able to join the discussion. So I may be connected, but since I will be moving around, so
No,
In any
it's-
case, you are the first speaker. You're the first speaker. So we'll have you first of all. And then if there are any queries, we can, I'm sure with the other experts on the screen out here, we'll be able to handle them. Right? So
Amit,
with that,
you can actually leave, I mean, before you leave, whatever comments you have in the comments, so that we can, other speakers can see. Yeah, thank you.
that's right. So let me give a brief introduction to the speakers of the day. We have, first of all, Dr. Amit Shankar Saha. He is an assistant professor in the Department of English at CCOM Skills University. He is also a researcher, critic, short story writer, and poet. He obtained his PhD in English from Calcutta University in 2010. His doctoral dissertation is called The Indian Diaspora in Transition, reading Anita Desai, Bharati Mukherjee, Sunetra Gupta, and Jhumpa Lahiri. His research articles have appeared in journals and books nationally and also internationally. And well, welcome Amit Shankar Saha. Welcome to this panel. The second speaker will be Dr. Debadish Bandyopadhyay, who is a professor of English at Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. Debashish, welcome. Formerly, he was professor at Vidyasagar University and BHU. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Guanajuato, Mexico. And as a Fulbright scholar, he pursued research on American cultural identity in USA. He's taught as adjunct faculty at California State University, Fresno, and he's also been a Charles Wallace postdoctoral fellow. He has a book, Locating the Anglo-Indian Self in Ruskin Bond, a post-colonial review that was brought out by Anthem Press, New York. So welcome, Dr. Debadish Bandyopadhyay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. The third speaker will be Professor Kalpana. Professor Kalpana completed her post-graduation at Bangalore University and her MPhil and PhD from Pondicherry University. As a recipient of the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute's Graduate Research Award in 1994, she was affiliated to the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. And there she was mentored by none other than Professor Stephen Sliman, whose name we are so familiar with. She received her doctorate in 1996 for her thesis on Alice Munro and Shashi Deshpande. And she has several awards. Kalpana, where do you teach now? Are you teaching somewhere? I can't hear you.
Please unmute yourself.
No, please
Kalpana,
unmute yourself.
Please unmute yourself.
unmuted. I have unmuted.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, where do you teach now?
I teach at Pondicherry University. I'm heading the department here.
Okay, because it wasn't mentioned out here. Next, we have Julie Banerjee, Dr. Julie Banerjee Mehta, and she was selected as one of 16 most influential South Asians in Canada. An author and specialist in post-colonial, diasporic, and world literatures, she has conceptualized and taught the Chancellor Emerita and Senator Vivian Poy Endowed Program. It sounds so impressive. Wow. At the Canadian Academy on Asian Cultures and Literature in the University of Toronto. She has researched and published extensively on the diaspora, post-colonial studies, and reconstruction post-genocide. And she's the author of Dance of Life, the Mythology, History and Politics of Cambodian Literature, and also the bestseller, Strong Man, the biography of Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen with Harish Mehta. So welcome to this session, Dr. Mehta. She has a PhD from the University of Toronto, and she's currently teaching in Loreto College, Calcutta. Then we have Dr. Somdatta Mandal, who retired as Professor of English and Chairperson at the Department of English, Vishwa Bharati Shantiniketan. She has held several administrative posts, and she's lectured widely in national and international fora. A recipient of several prestigious international fellowships and awards from the Fulbright Foundation, Charles Wallace Trust, Rockefeller Foundation, Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, and Sahitya Akademi. Her areas of interest are varied: American literature, contemporary fiction, film, cultural studies, diaspora studies, and translation. She has authored and edited and co-edited several books, journals, anthologies. Somdata has been a great friend for a long time, and I know whenever she goes anywhere to give a lecture, there are people who come from surrounding areas and cities to listen to her lecture. Good to see you here, Somdata. Then we have Dr. Tanya Chakravarti, who is currently the Dean of Students' Welfare, Diamond Harbour Women's University. Chakravarti has a PhD on gender representations in Ernest Hemingway under the supervision of Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta. She has formerly taught at Sri Shikshayatan College, Kolkata, and as guest faculty at Calcutta University. She visited the US to participate in the IVLP program, as it is called. Her areas of interest include gender studies, American literature, and literature of the diaspora. Chakravarti is the Joint Secretary, Executive Council of the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, and the first coordinator and steering committee member of the American Literature and Culture Interest Group, which is aided by the US Consulate General, Kolkata. So welcome to all of you. And I can see that the clock is ticking away. So let's get down to it. And sir, is it okay? You have something to say, sir?
Let me have the, thank you very much. Let me have the pleasure of introducing you to all those who are watching the show today. Professor Manju Jakka is a senior professor at Shulni University, Solan, Himachal Pradesh, and she was formerly a professor and chairperson of the Department of English at Punjab University. And she has published more than 20 books in her entire career and more than 60 research papers in reputed national and international journals. As a creative writer, she has published a collection of poems, a play, 3 novels, including Scandal Point, which was published in 2011, Amalta's Avenue, it was published in 2014. Her non-fiction publications titled The Next Milestone was commissioned by the World Health Organization on the management of disability, a collection of poems. So that came out in 2019. A 4th novel is about the light of the day. You know, well, it's going to be maybe in 2021, 2020, all of us were almost filled by the pandemic. As a chairperson of Chandigarh Sahitya Akademi from 2008 to 15, she organized and participated in several literature festivals. She is presently the president, chief functionary of MELO, the Society for Study of Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the World. Additionally, Jakka has held the post of Executive Director of International American Studies Association and also serves on the advisory board of several international organizations. It's a great privilege to have you with us today, Professor Manju.
Thank you, sir. I've just eaten some more minutes out of that time. But I must tell you, we just concluded a literature festival yesterday. It was a 3-day literature festival in Shulini University, a virtual one in which we had more than 60 speakers, and it ran through 20 sessions. We had some very good speakers. We keep having such events. And particularly every Friday, we have a literary event. If anybody is interested in joining, just let me know. Anyway, coming back to it, Amit Shankar Saha, can we have your presentation first?
Yeah, thank you very much. I am thankful to Sahitya Akademi and especially to Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta for inviting me to present my paper at this gathering. The seminar on Diasporic Indian English Literature, and my paper is titled The Diasporic Indian English Literature, the Space of Disjuncture. The concept of diaspora in Indian culture has pre-existing linguistic formulations since ages past. India is a land of migrations, just it was mentioned a little while ago also, both to and fro. The existence of multiplicity of cultures, religions, language, thoughts, and so on are proof of the inflow of migrants into the subcontinent from prehistoric times. And so has been the outflow of migrants from the Indian landmass to places like Java, Sumatra, Borneo, just to name a few, since ancient times. Hence, India, long before the advent of theories of diaspora and all, had devised its own linguistic formulations to appropriate the state of being displaced. A vernacular term like Desh does not stand for any country as such, but essentially one's village or place of origin or original home, which may be within the same nation state as defined by modern nomenclature of political unity. Similarly, a term like Paschim does not essentially mean the Occident, that is Europe. It just means the western part of the country of India. These native words associated with migration have the same etymologic that tropes of modern diaspora formations have generated, like home, homeland, origins, east-west binary, and others. So, it cannot be said that the diasporic Indian English literature is entirely an emergent genre without any tradition or roots. We have these linguistic formulations pre-existing. Let us now come to the title of this seminar. Term by term, let us take it. Diasporic Indian English Literature. The first term is diasporic, obviously. The indication is to the Indian diaspora. And specifically the modern Indian diaspora, which is again divided into two parts. The sugar diaspora, comprising the indentured laborers who migrated during the colonial rule, and the masala diaspora, constituting post-independence voluntary migrations to the metropolitan centers of the West. Then there are other less acknowledged diasporas, like those in the Gulf countries, the twice displaced from Africa, the Tamils in Sri Lanka, the Mirpuris in Bradford, and so on. So this is about the diaspora. Then we come to the term Indian. And here we associate it with tradition. Salman Rushdie, in his essay Imaginary Homelands, says, and I quote, Swift, Conrad, Marx, and even Melville, Hemingway, Bellow are as much our literary forebears as Tagore or Raja Ram Mohan Roy. It is interesting, unquote, it is interesting to note that many of these diasporic Indian writers of the second generation, especially, have found the literary heritage in the Indian literary tradition, in addition to the tradition of the Western literature. Jhumpa Lahiri's works have been compared with the works of Ashapurna Devi, Sharat Chandra Chattopadhyay, and Rabindranath Tagore, apart from being part of the American literary tradition. So this is about the Indian part. Next, the third term is English. And here comes the disjuncture, because we are mixing native tradition with a colonial language. Arjun Appadurai, in his influential essay titled Disjuncture and Difference in the Global Cultural Economy, describes 5 disjuncture zones that comprise the global cultural economy. I will take 2 of them. One is the native tradition that I mentioned, that comes from the term Indian, belongs to the zone of ethnoscape. That is what he has nomenclatured. Ethnoscape, because it emanates from the landscape of people. So the native tradition, the Indian tradition that we know, is emanating from the landscape of the people who populate this land. Then we have the colonial language, that is the English language, which belongs to the zone of ideoscape, because it involves politics of the state in order to capture power. Language is always associated with power. The British Baudelaireized our native language to make us mute. And in the process, we captured their language to strike back and reach their land. The diasporic Indian may be a nationalist and swear allegiance to the country of origin, and still, by being a willing participant to his or her mediation through a language that is an instrument of global capitalist oppression, that very allegiance is weakened. Here lies the disjoint or disjuncture, where the ethnoscape and the ideoscape coexist in a complex relationship with each other. The Indian English, the Indian comprising the ethnoscape because it belongs to tradition, and the English language belongs to the ideoscape. And there's a disjuncture between them. And these complex notations of scenes of dual territoriality or in the theories of diaspora, these are in themselves in disjoint, because there are scenes of dual territoriality which Sudesh Mishra mentions, and then he also mentions the scene of lateral connectivity. But that is too much jargon specific. But what I'm pointing at is that this complex relationship between ethnoscape and ideoscape, and it is this space of disjuncture from where literature is born. And hence we come to the fourth term of our seminar's title, that is literature. This diaspora literature we can define from the time of Deen Muhammad. This diaspora, modern Indian diasporic English literature, we can define from the time of Deen Muhammad to the time of Jhumpa Lahiri, which is like contemporary. It is interesting to note that the history of diasporic Indian writing is as old as the modern Indian diaspora. In fact, the first Indian writing in English, creative writing, is credited to Deen Muhammad. His book Travels of Deen Muhammad was published in 1794. This book predates by 40 years the first English text written by an Indian residing in India, and that was Kailash Chandra Dutt's A Journal of 48 Hours of the year 1945, which was published in 1835. So almost 41 years. Both these texts, like in the earlier symposium on 2nd February of Sahitya Akademi, both these texts were mentioned by the speaker, Dr. Gargi Tolapatra, when the discussion was on the origins of Indian English literature. But to come back to the diaspora literature, the diaspora literature is generated by a particular kind of awareness known as diaspora consciousness, which, according to Sudesh Mishra, is an intellectualization of an existential condition. Even though diaspora studies is culture specific, and existentialism, as we know, is a philosophy which involves macro narratives, I believe, particularly in the case of the modern Indian diaspora, Mishra's equation works because, as at the start I said, the linguistic formulations of diaspora studies already existed in India's native terminologies, like I mentioned, Desh and Paschim. Moreover, concepts like Indian woman going to the in-laws' place to live after marriage gives us a prototype of the diaspora. We have seen in, say, Jhumpa Lahiri's namesake, Oshima going to live with her husband in the West. So that was the prototype of diaspora when in, say, Ashapurna Devi's when Shottobati comes to live with her husband from the village to Kolkata. It has the same existential crisis we see. But obviously, the trajectory of the modern Indian diaspora and its theorization has archival specificity, and here not trying to attempt to generalize the particular situation with a universal pen. Okay, just pointing out the similarity. But as I said, there is a disjuncture from where this literature emanates. A few illustrations with the point. I'm taking the example from Anita Desai's novel Bye Bye Blackbird, which was one of the earliest post-independence diasporic works of fiction. Here we see the protagonist Dave living in England in the 60s, argues with his friend Adit that he would not like to stay in a racist England. But at the same time, he also acknowledges that he would go back to India as an England returned teacher. Dave seemed to have nationalist allegiance to India, and yet, as a transnational, he ruptures that allegiance. The disjuncture is quite apparent. Another example, like say from Lahiri's short stories, Interpreter of Melodies. Here we see the protagonist, Mrs. Das, born and bred in the West, visits India as a tourist and makes a stark confession about her life in New Jersey to an Indian tourist guide with whom she just has a fleeting contact. Mrs. Das does not find a confidant in the West. It is because she knows that she has a refuge away from her place of dwelling. And these two places are not in continuum, but in disjoint.
I think there's a connectivity issue. So while we wait for Amit Saha to come back, let me remind you that he's 14 minutes into his talk, and he has another couple of minutes to wind up, but let's give him some time. He has been, so far,
Yeah.
yes, he's come back. Amit, we lost you for a couple of minutes.
Yeah, some call came.
You have a couple of minutes
So where
more,
was I?
Amit.
Yeah, okay, I'll just wind up.
Yeah.
So as I was telling in Jhumpa Lahiri's short stories, Interpreter of Melodies, Mrs. Das makes a confession. She comes to India as a tourist. She makes a confession to a tourist guide. She does not find a confidant in the West. Why? Because she knows that in India, she has a place which is in disjoint with the other place where she is residing. And this condition gives her the possibility of coexistence of multiple disjunctured identities. And this is the crux of diasporic literature. It makes possible the existence of multiplicities in the space of this disjuncture. And that is where I should end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amit. We appreciate that you ended your paper well in time. From that, we move on to Dr. Debashish Bandyopadhyay. Dr. Debashish, all yours.
Thank you, ma'am. So I apologize at the very beginning that I am not an expert on diasporic studies at all. When Sahitya Akademi contacted me for this occasion in less than a week to spare, I felt nervous and agreed with some hesitation. This is not so much a paper as such, I'm telling you at the very beginning. I will be trying to bring some scattered thoughts together on my recent excursions into the literature of Rabindranath Tagore's tours to the USA. He stayed in the USA altogether for 17 months. And according to the more inclusive redefinitions of diasporic consciousness, propounded by scholars like Rogers Brubaker and Agnieszka Weiner, I would prefer to categorize some of Tagore's home thoughts from abroad as bordering on diasporic consciousness. From the point of view of a highly corporatized and globalized worldview, the idea of diaspora, for that matter, is constantly undergoing change. At one point of time, Tagore's letters from the USA and compositions in the USA embodying this American musings would very much become the part of diasporic studies. I'm afraid if it might appear too premature to take the liberty of broadening the scope of diasporic studies in this sense here, please bear with me for some more time. I would like to cogitate on Rabindranath Tagore's impression of small town and rural America in the first decade of the 20th century as a sort of diasporic perspectival experience. I would try to understand whether it is possible to see Tagore's take on America through what Arjuna Padurai in his 1990 essay calls disjuncture and difference in the cultural flow of ethnoscapes and idioscapes. Amit had made my task easier because he had already introduced this particular concept of Appadurai. I'm not going into the nitty-gritties of the conceptual part of Appadurai. However, I would like to elaborate a little upon the notion of idioscape, which has been cursorily mentioned by Amit because of the lack of time. Tagore brought with him, when he came to live with his son in Urbana, Champaign in Illinois, and journeyed through the rich Californian orange orchards, did not so much suffer a disjunctive shock as Appadurai points out diasporic experiences in the USA suffer due to what he calls the phenomena of quote-unquote Americanization or commoditization of cultural experiences which are markedly different from home. Appadurai proposes an elementary framework for the exploration of the disjunctures between economy, culture, and politics that engender the complexity of the current global economy. He speaks about the 5 scapes of which had already been introduced by Amit. I would elaborate a little upon idioscapes because that is very pertinent to my take upon Tagore's visit to the USA. Idioscapes are images of a political kind related to the ideologies of states and counter-ideologies of movements oriented to capturing state power or a piece of it. These idioscapes are composed of the Enlightenment worldview, which consists of a concatenation of ideas, terms, and images, including freedom, welfare, rights, sovereignty, and the master term democracy. The master narrative of enlightenment in its differential diasporic avatars involve problems of both a semantic and a pragmatic nature. Semantic to the extent that words and their lexical equivalents require careful translation from context to context in their global movements, and pragmatic to the extent that the use of these words by political actors and their audiences may be subject to very different sets of contextual conventions that mediate their translation into public politics. Such conventions are not only matters of the nature of political rhetoric, but also involve what sets of communicative genres are valued in what way. For example, one of the diasporic migrations of enlightenment to the East has been the rise of nationalism in India towards the end of the 19th century. If the political rhetoric of the time had coined the term, quote unquote, Swadeshi, to defeat the capitalistic mercantile exploitation of the colonial government, its new nationalist equivalent at the present time is Atmanirbhar Bharat. The connotations of the two coinages, however, differ significantly in terms of their pragmatic chronotropic implications relevant to different kinds of nationalisms. In the same way, when Tagore's lectures in the US, compiled in the treatise called Sadhana, is given an American name, it curiously took a Whitmanesque Song of Myself title, Realization of the Self. The political gulf that divides the implications of Swadeshi and Atmanirbhar Bharat, however, is more pronounced than the difference between what Tagore meant by sadhana and Whitman's transcendentalist intuition of the soul in quote unquote myself. A differential analysis of the two diasporic conversions, one of an Enlightenment offshoot in a diachronic historical context in India, and the other an Indian spiritual emigrant to America, tells us that the idioscapic distortion in the former stands in contrast to almost a smooth indigenization in case of the latter. It might not sound an absurd proposition to read this phenomenon as an allegory of the relatively easy transaction between Tagore's feelings in Bolpur and that in Arbana, which I will be discussing a little further on. Perhaps Tagore's diasporic experience in America is not what I would say exotic, as the perceptions of the political history of India spanning a century from Swadeshi to Atmanirbhar Bharat is. Had Tagore lived through this latter phase of Indian history, he could have felt a greater shock than the kind of disagreement his feelings might have suffered during his sojourn in the US. In fact, the characteristics of diasporic experience depend on variables of time and space in a chronotopic construction, so much that if one of the factors is kept constant while the other is altered, the subject's generational experiences alter likewise. Of course, the factor of space here is more a geographical space uninterrupted by political inscriptions of borders and frontiers. That is to say, a Punjabi Hindu living in West Punjab before the partition was considered an Indian native of the place, while post-partition, if he continued to stay on in the same place, he could well have been ironically defined as a first-generation diasporic. Or for that matter, if a Mexican living in Monterrey wished to stay on in the same place after the Treaty of Guadalupe in January 1847, he could as well be known as a diasporic Mexican in the US. Irrespective of such political eventualities, problematizing the definition of diaspora, we would like to consider, for the sake of convenience, geographical terrains infected only by time and domestic politics rather than international political realignments of state borders for our understanding of the difference in cultural mutations across time inside a country and cultural flows across nations and geographical spaces in time and across times. Even then, Appadurai's notion of idioscapic formulation of diaspora does not remain less problematic. Tagore's stay in Arbana in 1912 and 13 could then be looked upon, if possible, a less diasporic experience than the difference in the two experiences in case he had lived in Bolpur in 1921 and had outlived his age to remain present in the same place in the days of dogmatic ethno-religious nationalism in 2021. In fact, Americanization, for that matter, is not a homogeneous concept as much as it is marked by varying time and space. The cultural and psychogeographical experience of a common American in a big American city, in contrast to his experience in a US small town or countryside at a particular moment, is as much different from each other as alluded to by Allen Ginsberg, when almost in a surreal conjuration, he nostalgically pines for the romantic days of Walt Whitman in a supermarket in California. The chronotopic markers of landscape experiences perhaps became gradually more prominent for Indian diasporic sensibilities in the US since World War I and II. The psychogeographical correlations between experiences gathered by an Indian in small town India vis-a-vis a small town America were considerable before the changes wrought by globalization in the third world became intensely perceptible. The disjunctures modeled on Appadurai's network of five scapes do not characterize the diasporic sensibility of an Indian traveling from, say, Mumbai to small town Fresno or Clovis, as Manju had actually gone to Fresno, she knows it better, in California during postmodern days of late capitalism. The capitalist strains of production incapacitate the agency of an Indian consumer in an Indian multiplex at a time when corporate MNC players are promoted ironically by the state that draws its idioscape from the forces of dogmatic ethno-religious nationalism. If it is possible to explain such apparently paradoxical political-economic developments in Appadurai's terms as indigenization, or transnational capitalist idioscapes in a manner European Enlightenment ideologists, diasporic Indian version, enjoyed nurturance during Indian nationalism at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. The distinctive religious underpinnings of the former makes the indigenizing process more crooked than the assimilation of a secular, ideological European American construct in the context of a relatively secular anti-colonial movement during the time of Tagore. During Tagore's first visit to the US in 1912-13, his rather anti-nationalist persuasions and monotheistic Brahmo convictions corresponded well with the transnational diasporic cultural milieu and the Unitarian Church's worldview prevalent in Urbana. Rural Urbana at that time had a tremendous psychogeographical influence on Tagore, so much so that he envisaged the creation of Shantiniketan to some extent upon experiences of the comparable ethnoscape of Urbana. In case of Tagore, Appadurai's idea of the indigenizing potential of the diasporic space in the USA saw its reverse effect in Tagore's repatriation of the Urbana and small-town American experience to Bolpur in India. On his arrival to New York in 1912, Tagore's first experience was not agreeable. He soon took the train westward and found the plains of Illinois much more to his liking. In a letter to his American friend William Rothenstein, he wrote, quote, "The country round is flat and open, which has a great attraction for me, reminding me of my own scenery." Unquote. The months which followed were probably the happiest of all those Tagore spent in the US. He lived naturally and quietly in a house in a small university town. Tagore's Bengali letters from Urbana, which had already been translated, compiled in the Chithi Patra volume 4 and 5, testified to his experience of the daily sight of a university in the midst of the Midwestern plains as considerable inspiration behind his dream of founding his own university on the plains of Bengal, a plan which he put into effect in 1921. Remember, this year is the centenary of Vishwabharati. Somdatta is there. The ethnoscape of Urbana, from Tagore's perspective, cannot be called, after Appadurai, an imagined world. It was a lived experience, mediated only by his memory of living in a Bengal plain, rather than by any varying repertoire of images presented to him through mediascapes. The disagreeable experience of metropolitan New York was simply supplanted by the real experience of comfort in small-town Urbana. Reality and the poet-philosopher's aesthetic sensibilities worked in conjunction in this American small town, so much so that he returned to Urbana during the second tour to America in 1916-17 and talked of his overall impression of America as congenial, mostly because his experience in Illinois had overwhelmed all forms of perspectival disjunctures that the diasporic sensibility, according to Appadurai, is likely to suffer. The lectures that Tagore was invited to deliver in the metropolitan institutions in the US, especially Harvard, are compiled as Sadhana with the help of his American friend Ernest Reeves. The aesthetic and spiritual comfort that you attend in small town America. Will I be given another 2 or 3 minutes? Manju,
Take a minute or so.
Okay. So I'm not getting into the details of sadhana because it requires a much more closer reading. So I will be coming to the end. I'm just giving you the simulacrum of my thoughts, those particular pieces of my thoughts that I had actually thinking of. It is in the process of writing this particular paper. So I thought of actually speaking about the motive or the basic theme of the paper. So just to come to the last point that I would like to make. During his stay in Urbana in 1912, the missionary consciousness which had been gestating in Tagore's mind for some time found expression. His career as a lecturer in English began when his local Unitarian minister, the Reverend Mr. Vale, invited him to speak on religious experience to a Sunday evening group interested in comparative religions. The 51-year-old poet-philosopher made such an impression that he was he was asked to talk again and again on subsequent Sunday evenings. It is not strange that his idea was influenced by the nascent Unitarian movement in England and the United States in the 1820s and the 1830s by Ram Mohan Roy. Tagore's easy acceptance by the Unitarian Church in Urbana, because the comparable ideologies of the two facilitated in him a sense of unalloyed identification with the new ethnoscape, which was the inspiration behind his 1922 book of essays entitled Creative Unity. The fact that he dedicated his play Chitra to Mrs. Moody, with whom he stayed in Chicago, and Creative Unity to a Chicago friend of his called Edwin H. Lewis, who was Unitarian by persuasion, is proof of Tagore's sense of both ethnoscapic and idioscapic belonging to small town America. The psychogeographic identification with American countryside was effected also during Tagore's second visit to the USA in 1916-17. With the beginning of World War I, Tagore repudiated the nationalist construct of European Enlightenment. His critique of nationalism was received with considerable fervor in different cities of the US, including Chicago. During his lecture tour in Southern California, he felt a sense of déjà vu on visiting the orange orchards. He even meditated upon an orange tree. If we consider his letters to American and European friends as a part of a literary corpus embodying the poet-philosopher's diasporic consciousness, the generic chronotopic convention of diasporic English literature would not only broaden its legitimate horizons beyond the hitherto acceptable ambit, but would also redefine diasporic sensibilities by recognizing psychological tools as hermeneutic imperative for rewriting textualities of epistemic flows. The very notion of Appadurai's cultural flows of disjuncture would be completely reversed with the case of Tagore. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Debashish. We've had two papers so far, and even though they are dealing with separate issues, the first one talked about Anita Desai and Jhumpa Lahiri, and the second one focused on Tagore. Still, there is a lot of similarity between the two because they have both focused on Arjun Appadurai, his ideas on idioscape and ethnoscape and disjuncture. So keep your ideas noted down and we'll have a discussion at the end. Meanwhile, we'll go on to the next speaker, and that is Kalpana, Professor Kalpana. Yes, Kalpana?
Thank you very much for the introduction as well as for inviting me. A very good afternoon to everyone here, and I'm indeed very happy to be here for this particular occasion. I just wanted to ask, can I use a PPT?
Yeah.
Yes, you may.
You can share the screen.
You'll have to share your screen.
Yeah, I will just try that. I don't use Zoom generally, so I'm not very familiar with it.
The process is more or less the same.
Okay.
Go to the bottom, share screen, and show your PPT.
Is it coming up?
Yes, yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm looking at particularly series of writers from Canada. Not too many, because I don't have the time and the space to discuss everyone. But I thought I would like to particularize certain problems that they are bringing up. We have generally, when we talk about diasporic problems, you see, we discuss generally an indecision regarding the home, because there's always a question of which place one belongs to. This has been a general trend. The second aspect that all of us know is that there is an ambivalence, especially in terms of where does one belong. One is not very feeling rooted in a particular situation, or one doesn't have an idea where one is. So there is a problem with this kind of envisagement. Thirdly, we have identities that are ambiguous, because the identities are always in a kind of flux. And most often people who come from a diasporic background are unsure where they should actually place their identities. They have a whole series of them and they're unsure where to. And I think this is probably what Appadurai was also pointing out when he talked about the scapes. Then we have the problem of binary cultures, because, you know, adoption of various cultures, and especially one moves from a place to place, the dislocation always increases the concept of multiple cultures, and that plurality, how does one look into it, is a question that one has. So what I wanted to do today was I wanted to look at how the questions, at least of resolving, how do these problems get resolved, and how do the writers especially discuss these. So with these were the few ideas that I had with which I'm beginning. I look at two concepts. One is identity and the other is culture. I have two quotations here, one from Sokfeld and the other from Handler. Sokfeld's quote says that a concept of identity has to be seen in close connection to a concept of self. And the other one that Handler talks about is that culture gets constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed as people pursue their identity. Unquote. I am interested in both these quotations basically because I think in some way the paper that I'm going to present to you discusses these concepts of identity, where the writers are to some extent bringing in a concept of the self. Similarly, they're also constructing, deconstructing, and reconstructing their identities in different ways by which probably they are trying to explain what they mean by their existence. I'm not so sure whether all of them, when they try to do this, are victorious in the attempt that they do, or whether they have been able to get over and get a proper stable identity. But there is an attempt. That's what I wanted to discuss. Now, what are the strategies of constructions that they do? Again, I use particular quotation here from the idea of the implosion of identity politics since 1989, which actually, I don't read the whole quote, explains that there's a marked proliferation of claims to rights and resources made through, basically these aspects, that is gender, generation, race, religion, sexuality, style, culture, and various displacements of class. Now, why is it that we are looking at this? Is because I do think that even in a place like a diasporic community, most of the time writers are tackling innumerable problems. It's not just a question of two homes or two cultures. It is much more than that. It is also a question of where one belongs, what class one belongs, what is the gender dimensions, how does one get across it. So there are innumerable problems that are there, and it is not easy to explain this by just looking at diaspora and homogenizing and saying that these are the problems that they face. Similarly, whenever there is this question of even a post-colonial attempt to look at them, the whole problem that comes up is the conditionality of these people and how it gets overlaid and undercut by the fractal politics of difference. So even when we look at an Indian diaspora, let's say in America or in Canada, they are not homogeneous because there are many gaps even between them. There are many things which seem to be very different among the groups of people that are in it. So we have to keep this in our background, because unless we think about that or we critically attempt to look at this, we may not be able to question the other things that we are discussing. Now, this is the first part of the paper, and my attempt was here to outline few Indian Canadian writers and depict how the diasporic problems that were mentioned earlier are brought in by these people. And then the second is to explain how issues of identity and culture are involved. In this position, I looked at a couple of writers. I chose first Uma Parmeshwaran. Uma Parmeshwaran was one of the first few diasporic Canadian writers who cropped up. She comes from a Tamil background, and in fact, she mentions in an interview that for her, going to Canada and being there was a pleasant experience, unlike others who generally talk about discrimination and race. She also repeatedly goes back to the fact that, using myths in various kinds of locations. In fact, one of her plays, Sita's Promise, uses mythology in a way where, there is an affirmation that multiculturalism is part of the diasporic group. And she talks about Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana, who visit Canada during their exile. And then Sita's promise again that she will visit again Canada. Now, in a way, what she does in most of the works is that she utilizes these mythical identities and transports them to Canada. And in fact, even in one of her poems, she uses, the Asini-born river becomes the Ganga. So these kind of transpositions that she utilizes is an important aspect for us because it promotes for us certain questions that I have, which I was thinking of, and which she at least attempts to give us. She says that, you know, we are caught or sandwiched between two worlds, and she calls it as the Trishanku syndrome. She also mentions that she is a writer activist. She says that using the myth delivers for her a sense of belonging. She also talks about how there is a crisis of culture when people are abroad and they do not recognize the importance of their own cultures. So these are some of the points that she utilizes in her work. Then she also discusses, as I already told you, where in the place where she exists, she brings in imaginary homelands through most of her works. As I said again, I'm not delving into each of the works because I do not have the time, but these are many of the things that come up in almost every work of hers. The second writer that I wanted to talk to you was Anita Raubadami, who is, upcoming writer and who has been quite established in the recent years. And again, you know, Anita Raubadami comes from a background of coming from, a country where she's grown up here in a very blended atmosphere. Even though she's a South Indian, she mentions that most of her life was spent in North India. She also comes from a background where people are from the railways, and so she says, since her family was from, you know, her father was in the railways, they moved around a lot. So she's very used to the movement as such. But again, her works interestingly discuss these aspects of family-oriented situations where the family is of the key idea. There are lots of dislocations, people moving in and around in most of her works. Patriarchy and gender play a big role in most of the works. She has a number of points with regard to generational gaps. And in fact, especially the mother and daughter relationships are very much discussed in her works. And her novels are, of course, quite women-centric. She also has this question of the ordinariness of life, and she explains in an interview that the ordinariness of life is something that she sees as being heroic. So she says that I'm not reading the whole quote there. She mentions that I find just ordinary people very heroic because they seem to go around the business of living, and that by itself for her is an act of heroism. This is a facet that I find extremely fascinating because the common ordinary people live in an existence where they are unable to make anything more of their lives. And to see that as heroism is something that is important for anyone. The third writer that I looked at is Rupi Kaur. Now, this writer has been a writer who's dismissed by literary circles simply because people think that she's not a very prominent writer who writes simplistic writing, and they think that she's an Instagram, fantasy. She is not talked about as being very important by many writers. People think that the kind of writing she does is rather, like just mentioning something that you are doing as a direct talk to somebody else. But she has become a sensation. And in fact, she's such a sensation that quite a few people are now discussing her. And the reason why Kaur becomes important for her, us at least, especially for us, is that the fact is that she's moved away from the other two women writers that we looked at earlier. She doesn't talk about discrimination, about racism, about culture. Her point is that she wants to be very, very simple in her writings. She wants to be direct. She wants, in some way, love to be discussed. She doesn't want anything to be said in a subtle way. She wants her trauma and survival. These are the aspects that she thinks need to be coming out. And it seems that the youngsters today are very much enamored by this kind of writing, where they're trying to see Rupi Kaur as somebody that they would like to in some way, adopt as a writer whom they themselves idealize and bring up. Now, why I wanted to use Rupi Kaur here was basically because I wanted to point out the fact that the diasporic elements that I discussed in the initial stages have moved away, and we're looking at a new set of identities which seem to be so different from the normal of discrimination, of dislocation and things like that. And interestingly, we have a fourth writer, with which probably I'll end today's discussion, who is so much different from any of the others that we have looked at. And this is a woman called as Vivek Shraya, who is a transgender. And what does she do is that she brings in the politics in some way of trying to explain that she uses her queer identity to question where is she placed in the diasporic background. And she is bringing you, this is a photographic exhibition of hers called as Trisha. And she's, of course, the author of 2 novels called as She of the Mountains and The God Loves Hair. She has also written a number of short stories. But I wanted to just give you this example of Trisha, because here what she does in the photographs is that one of these is her mother's and one is herself. There's a whole series of photographs. And in every photograph where she looks like her mother, she has brought in an element of modernness that is there. In fact, I couldn't place that picture here today, but there's a picture where she's talking on a cell phone, and the mother is actually talking on a landline, which belongs to an old era. So she brings in this element of trying to discuss in some way the notion that, there is a different genres of people who are there, that like a mother and she come from different genres. But at the same time, there is a similar vein or a similar thread that bonds them together, and which seems to be an important aspect for her to be discussing. And then again, we go back to these questions of what is she trying to look at. She brings in family and navigation as an aspect. She brings around cultural connections. She talks about generational changes. She also discusses diaspora and being queer itself. Now, the 2 people that I discussed at the later point, that is Rupi Kaur and Vivek Shraya, interestingly enough, break spatial backdrops because they occupy spaces which we cannot describe as being diasporic. They are also occupying spaces by which they are talking about being novelties in different ways, because now the one says that she's a transgender and the other says that she's an Instagram success. So we are looking at 2 very different aspirations of diasporic community that comes up through the writings. So now the questions that we have, or the resolutions that I want to ask, is that what are the ways that we have looked at home in the 4 writers? And home, again, as I said, if in the first writer she has carried the home from India into Canada, and the second has tried to navigate between the 2. The third and the fourth have made new ideas about home for themselves. No longer is home something that is a conjecture of saying which is the host land and the homeland. Spatial markers have changed. No longer are they very much in imaginative places. Both the younger writers occupy very realistic spaces. They try to explain that these are the spaces that belong to them and that they're very comfortable in this, unlike the first 2 writers. Then they also begin to forge new identities, unlike the earlier 2 writers, like the Anita Robadami or like Uma Parmeshwaram. They've started to develop new identities, which I'm not so sure whether in diasporic identities we have even been discussing. They're also imagining innovative cultural representations, because no longer is it the novel, the poem, or a drama. It is things like small poems with images in Instagram, Twitter, social media, as well as photographs, memes, and these are the identities that the younger writers are taking. So anyway, I wanted to bring in this notion of looking at how these writers develop themselves and how diaspora becomes an important aspect by which we are looking at various concepts that they are trying to visualize. And I did not want to take too much of your time. I hope I've given you a small picture. It's a bird's eye view, I can say, of trying to talk about how writers have tried to build up the diasporic identities and cultures. And I hope I've given you a little bit of what I wanted to say. Thank you all for your patience and your time. And I'm very happy to have any questions that you have at the end. Thank you extremely.
Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you very much. And thank you for introducing to us a writer like Vivek Shraya that I personally was not aware of. You started with the regular markers, as you call them, home, identity, belonging, and so on. But then you moved on. You brought in Twitter and Instagram. I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussion on that. But for now, let us move on to Dr. Julie Banerjee Mehta. Dr. Julie Banerjee Mehta.
It gives me immense pleasure to be among this dynamic group of scholars, so invested in Indian writing in English in the diaspora. I would like very much to thank the Sahitya Akademi for this kind invitation, and my gratitude to Professor Sanjukta Das Gupta, a dynamic visionary academic with a remarkable aptitude for inclusiveness, who has introduced me to this wonderful group of people. I haven't been back in India for too long, so some of you might be strangers to me, but I do know you by your work. Dr. Rajmohan and Professor Jakka and all my panelist friends, my conversation today is in two parts. First, words, then images to connect the theory to the practice and the praxis. So I argue that in their deployment of the two most powerful cultural markers that reside in the tongue, language and food, Indian and Sri Lankan diasporic writers, specifically for this conversation today, Indian Canadian writer, and there you go, Professor Kalpana, you've made a wonderful segue for me to enter here. One of my favorite writers, Anita Raubadami, Sri Lankan Canadian novelists Shyam Selvadurai and Michael Ondaatje, an Indian American fiction writer, and now famous for her translation, Jhumpa Lahiri, are continuously raising a route, or if you use it as a pun, a route, by performing an act of hyphenation. This in turn signifies a transnational identity founded on the bedrock of unstable history, symptomatic of almost all immigrant communities. My intent in this conversation is to confront the multiplicity of hybridities that frequently occur in a range of narratives by these diasporic Asian authors and interrogate their employment as a strategy by the authors to first decenter and destabilize any construct of a homogeneous post-colonial nation, second, to sabotage polarity, and finally, to prevent any one kind of knowledge from being accorded the most favored status. Acknowledging that the politics of hybridity is fiercely contested, with advocates, denouncers, and ambivalent lining up on all sides, I maintain that Gloria Anzaldúa, the writer of Borderlands, is onto something when she points out that, and I quote, the fundamental question is how hybridity relates to power relations in the borderlands between difference. Is hybridity imposed or is it embraced? And who benefits? Is it reciprocal or one-sided? Does it enhance one group's power at the expense of another? And is the luxury of the privileged hybridity then? And does hybridity talk represent a much needed alternative to the binaries of center and periphery? I close quotes. I argue that in the hands of the diasporic writers, hybridity is often a tool skillfully utilized to force a conversation between the contested oppositional forces and from time to time to force the center of power to smell the tamarind chutney, though it may offend the unexposed white olfactory sense, or taste the fiery kimchi to understand that the Chinaman, the brown girl, the chutneyfied new entrants are here to stay, even to sully, muddy, the pristine, sterile monocultural landscape of a beautiful, clean, white North America. The thoughts I share with you today is also part of a discursive continuum on how food is represented in the works of Asian Canadian diasporic writers as a trope for the secret domain of desire, raising community consciousness and demanding social justice, often implicating the American and Canadian states with insidious intent and evincing remarkable literary alacrity in a world of vanishing borders, which I have written about in several books: Edible Histories and Cultural Politics, The Food History of Canada, 2011, and Globalization Beyond Vanishing Borders. Asian North American diasporic writers have been infusing a new oeuvre into the North American literary canon. And though the seepage of Asian North American identity might be slow, like strong oolong tea, it is potent and irreversible. Celebrated writers like the Chinese-Canadian Judy Fong Bates, Indian, Trinidadian, British, Canadian Shani Mutu, Japanese-Canadian Joy Kogawa and Kerry Sakamoto all live in two worlds and embrace the hyphen, but with different approaches. They embed their narratives with resonant contextualities of imperialism and domination they had once encountered as colonial subjects, and which they must still endure, much in the way that Edward Said posits in Culture and Imperialism. I quote, "The power to narrate or to block other narratives from forming and emerging is very important to culture and imperialism and constitutes one of the main connections between these two." End quote. But what excites me most about this conversation with you today is the fact that many of these ideas and impulses began in the classroom conversations at the University of Toronto, where the lived realities of second and third generation diasporic Indian, Sri Lankan, and other Asian senior year undergrads were explored through the texts written by diasporic Asian Canadian writers. Made possible by an endowment, rather generous, from the visionary Vivian Poy, the Hong Kong-born Canadian Senator and Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Toronto, I was privileged to conceptualize and teach this course, the first of its kind in the Canadian Academy under the aegis of the Canadian Studies program at University College, University of Toronto, which encourages the discourse on multiculturalism in the classroom. So celebrated diasporic writers were distinguished visitors to the classroom, and this allowed a unique bridge between these diasporic writers and the senior year undergraduates to make a connection about the idea of being diasporic. Amidst the vexed and contested history of Canadian immigration, many of the questions posed by the third or even fourth generation immigrants in the Canadian Academy was, who am I? These conversations, studded with gems of ethnographic post-colonial provocations, are the sparks that continue to drive my academic exploration and sustain my hunger in researching, publishing, teaching diasporic Asian foodways and linguascapes. The larger questions informing my research echo those raised by anthropologists Akhil Gupta and James Ferguson, historians Benedict Anderson and Gopal Balakrishnan, social scientists and cultural critics such as Susan Stanford Friedman, Dick Hebdige, and Simon Joring. Can language and food, and by language I mean the vernacular, can language and food operate as substitute for and thereby support disaggregated and or hybrid identities in the world of diasporic formations? To what extent might such culinary productions alone be the bearers of displaced identities, or must they be accompanied by the continuing use of language to origin? I will be looking at Chumpa Lahiri closely, to Anita Raubadami closely, to the works of Michael Ondaatje and the poetry of Rienzi Cruz, by asking whether they are actually performing an act of hyphenation while they're writing. This in turn signifies some sort of a transnational identity, as I said, which is founded on the bedrock of unstable history symptomatic of almost all immigrant communities. Professor Jakka, how much time do I have?
You have about another 5 minutes.
Lovely. Mohini is my techie whiz. Mohini, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
She is here.
Mohini, may we start the slideshow, please?
Sure, ma'am.
Thank you. So what I really would like to share with you today is the new global soul, then reimagining belonging and citizenship.
Excuse me, Julie, I see you have 22 slides. We do not.
Yeah, but there'll be about 10 seconds on each slides. I promise you,
We will
not
not
more.
have that kind of time. 22 slides means 22 slides.
Yeah, we'll just go through them very quickly. You said I have 5 minutes. I'll stick to that. Okay. So we are asking the question here, is the new global soul then reimagining belonging and citizenship by rebelling against epistemic violence, that is the language, the violence of how we learn, that is the language, and that is English, and cultural hegemony with the tongue. So the tongue becomes a site. Mohini, the next slide. Going back to Rushdie, expatriates, he says, are haunted by a sense of loss, and we try to reclaim, to look back, which is what all the authors, all the writers in the diaspora are generally trying to do. And we try to build these imaginary homelands as ideas of the mind. Next slide, please. So Anita Manur resonates in her theoretical argument that food is brought about by nostalgia, performing cultural identity, and establishing alternative networks of intimacy, not necessarily circumscribed by blood and filiation. So it's really the kind of imagined community and the Anderson type of thinking. Next slide, please. So constructing the homeland or reconstructing and remembering the homeland, diasporics see their condition differently from the host country because their personal histories are constantly conflated with the history of the nation that they have left behind. So we will see what Ondaatje and Renzi Cruz, the two leading poets of the Sri Lankan hyphenated Canadian community are doing with their poetry. Next slide, please, Mohini. Next, we'll skip this. We just go on to the writers. Thank you. So Montreal-based author Anita Raubadami invokes roti as a reiterative cultural marker in her novel, Can You Hear the Nightbird Call? And through this reiteration of this cultural trope of the roti, which is mentioned 22 times throughout the novel, she brings back the contested and bullet-holed history of Canadian immigration with the Komagata Maru and the way the Sikhs were treated back in 1914. And finally, of course, we know the story. These Sikhs were sent back and they were shot down in Baj Baj. Next slide, please. Now, I want to draw your attention to the Sri Lankan Canadian author Shyam Selvadurai, author of Funny Boy. My students kept asking him, are you a gay writer? Are you a South Asian Canadian writer? Are you a gay South Asian Canadian writer? And all he said was, I could not have written this coming out story if I was in Sri Lanka. I can only do it in this new adoptive homeland. Next slide, please. So my argument then is that the Asian American writers we explore are also trying to retrieve their own histories, often in the process writing themselves into the text and in remembering the stories in battleground nations such as Sri Lanka. And when I say re-member, that is also a performative act of putting together parts of the body which have been left behind and you're trying to retrieve now. Next slide. So in this idea of identity being sutured to belonging and what it means to be a hyphenated Canadian, what must be understood is that the difference between the American idea of melting pot and the Canadian idea of a tossed salad, as one Japanese student in my class explained multicultural in Canada, different voices, different strokes. If you're from America and Jhumpa Lahiri, you will look at your contentious battle with assimilation and acculturation and your hybridity differently as an American than from a Canadian hyphenated Asian author such as Anita Raubadami or Michael Ondaatje or Orion C. Cruz. Next slide, please. May I have one more minute, Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. So very quickly, Lahiri then explores the contact zones. And next slide, please. I want to leave you with this image of the Ilish March and how in Mrs. Sen, the short story and interpreter of melodies, which I think is perhaps the best example of both epistemic violence by the bus driver who makes fun of her and says, you know, I can't understand your accent. Do you really speak English? When she was carrying back the Ilish from an hour-long journey, which is really shad, which is a fake Ilish. But this is how much the identity of the homeland works on North American writers who are hyphenated from the North American diaspora. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. I think you made us all feel very hungry with your talk of food of different varieties. But we'll move on to the next speaker, and that is Somdatta Mandal, Professor Somdatta Mandal.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Please excuse my coughing within my lecture because I still have a very sore throat. I first thank Sahitya Akademi, Sangjukta Dasgupta, my friend, for inviting me to share some thoughts on the diaspora. And here I have, I think, most of the people I know so well for so many years, the chair especially, over decades of our diaspora studies. So it's a kind of homecoming to speak aloud. I want to share some of my thoughts about Indian diasporic writing in English. And I've just called it, is it the Des Pardes syndrome still valid? That is my title. Is the Des Pardes syndrome that we speak about in diasporic writing. Now, when we speak of the Indian diaspora, writers generally refer to persons of Indian birth or ethnicity living abroad. In earlier times, often as a result of induced emigration or indenture, usually by free election and often for economic, artistic, or social advantage. Emmanuel S. Nelson defines the Indian diaspora as the, I quote, historical and contemporary presence of people of Indian subcontinental origin in other areas of the world, unquote. Many are first-generation expatriates who continue to consider India to be their true home, the place of their nurture, values, and extended families, as well as their deepest sympathies and attachments. However, this is not universally the case. Accommodated to overseas lifestyles, many members of the diasporic existence experience a distinct dissonance when reintroduced to their former subcontinental culture. G.S. Sarath Chandra, in his novel, Sari of the Gods, 1998, states, and I quote, I was 27 when I left India for good. Since then, I've steered a new course in my life. Though India is always on my mind, there is no link that connects the sudden stop my life came to there and my new self. I leaped from one life to another, and in between, I left nothing but a vacuum. Only imagination and memory, when I need them, act as my bridges. Thus, whenever I go back to India, I'm a stranger wandering almost invisibly in familiar neighborhoods. Unquote. It is a very interesting trope about always the nostalgia of the diasporic individual, which he is challenging. Now, the literature of the Indian diaspora, therefore, is a body of writing in English produced by persons who identify themselves as of Indian heritage, who are living or have lived for some time at least outside the nation state of India or Mother India, in such places as Australia, Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, Mauritius, Malaysia, East Africa, or in the western continent of United States, Great Britain, Canada. Though the writing of the diasporic Indians is not new, it has of late raised complicated issues, which is the inward or talking point in post-colonial cultural and literary discourses. The formation of the Indian diaspora is one of the most significant demographic dislocations of modern times and can be classified, according to Sudesh Mishra, as the sugar and the masala diaspora. This same classification is termed by other critics as forced diaspora versus voluntary diaspora. Vinay Lal calls it diaspora of labor versus diaspora of longing. For most of the old diasporic writers, there is an unease of the dislocated and the deracinated who either from choice or from compulsion have abandoned their home in the country of their birth to stay in their adopted country. For instance, V.S. Naipaul, originally a third-generation immigrant from a branch of Dubes of a Brahmin village of Uttar Pradesh, who moved to Trinidad, expresses a sense of unease on the question of inheritance. And here, of course, you know I'm referring to his novel, The Way in the World, 1994. The first, second, or third generation writers who were migrants from compulsion, usually descendants of indentured laborers from India, sent to work in the various British colonial plantations. But for the migrants from choice, the situation is totally different. Usually upper middle class and cosmopolitan, these first and second generation writers live in a kind of cosmopolitan globalized world where the markers of their borderless state have often to be invented. Apart from the fictional example of Thamma, who is confused between the going and coming home from Dhaka in Amitav Ghosh's Shadow Lines, I am also reminded of a recent experience in an international flight where the plane was flying at about 30,000 feet height, and the screen in front of me had the image of the plane with an arrow over it that was constantly pointing towards Mecca, with the mileage notes in bold below it. This attempt at mooring oneself within the concept of a meta home, even in a borderless state of existence, is an important feature, I think, of contemporary diasporic writing. Academically speaking, the diasporic nature of Indian writing in English by the so-called voluntary diasporics once again has three visible sections. In the first category falls a writer like Bharati Mukherjee, who detested the idea of being called the immigrant writer and considered herself mainstream American. Simplistically, she saw expatriates resisting assimilation, immigrants welcoming it. For me, she said, it is a movement away from the aloofness of expatriation to the exuberance of immigration, unquote. In the second category falls the whole group of writers who shuttle between different continents. Within this group, some write about their immigrant experiences, while others physically live there, write on exoticism of their home country or of the characters who go as aliens and try to fit into the Western world. Sunetra Gupta is a case in point. Born in Calcutta, she lives in Oxford, and her novels, Memories of Rain, A Sin of Color, are set both in Calcutta and Oxford. Living in London, Meera Syal believes that duality and conflict makes you want to express yourself. That is why her generation is so outspoken. The third and the most complicated case, of course, is the category of writers whose origin is India, but whose work have no connections as such with the mother country. Bidisha Bandopadhyay, who incidentally never writes her surname, she just writes Bidisha, is a second generation Bengali writer born and brought up in England. Her debut novel, Sea Horses, is an urban pageant about three young British men and is in no way even remotely connected to India. Another interesting example is that of another young writer, Abha Davesar, whose debut novel, The Three of Us, is not what we usually expect from a 26-year-old immigrant South Asian woman writer. She creates a story that shrewdly explores sexual dependency from the perspective of a white male investment banker in Manhattan, New York, whose affairs range from having sex with his boss as well as his wife, all neatly timed with the help of a mini planner. In an article called India Away from Home, Davesar explains her predicament and raises several pertinent questions that can be applied to many others as well. And I quote from Davesar, "My novel was about and in the voice of a young man, Andre Bernard, a white man, a gay man, an American. The book was not of India in any sense of the term. So, can I be considered an Indian writer by virtue of my birth alone? Do I remain an Indian writer if I write in the voice of a white American man? Is it my literature that makes me Indian or my passport?" This class of questions will gain in significance as diasporic writing speaks in more and more tongues. Let us also examine the case of Jhumpa Lahiri, whose interpreter of maladies took the literary world by storm. Bill Buford, the literary editor of the New Yorker, catapulted her into limelight when he introduced her in his list of the 20 best young fiction writers in America today. Born in London, raised in Rhode Island, Connecticut, living in New York for several years, Jhumpa is presently settled in Rome, in Italy. She set some of her stories in Calcutta because of, I quote, "a necessary combination of distance and intimacy," unquote. And in an interview said, I quote, "I went to Calcutta neither as a tourist nor was a former resident, a valuable position, I think, for a writer. I learned to observe things as an outsider, and yet I also knew that as different as Calcutta is from Rhode Island, I belonged there in some fundamental way, in the ways I did not seem to belong to the US," unquote. Kiran Desai, whose debut novel, Hullabaloo in the Guava Orchard, found extraordinary welcome on both sides of the Atlantic, shuttles between New York and Cambridge, and even goes off to a remote retreat in Mexico, along with her mother, for literary inspiration. The way all these novelists' names are used at random by critics to define Indian writing in English as well make things complicated indeed. Also, the question remains whether writers living outside India forfeit the right to comment on behalf of an entire nation or not. Living in diaspora means living in forced or voluntary exile, and living in exile usually leads to severe identity confusion and problem identification. Or many people have spoken on this, and I don't want to repeat myself. I wanted to quote from Shame from Salman Rushdie, and also what Rushdie has written in Imaginary Homelands. We all know that the position of the exile or immigrant is one of, quote within quotes, profound uncertainties. The diasporic person is at home neither in the West nor in India and is thus unhomed, according to Homi Bhabha. Thus, the concept and the interpretation of home becomes vital in all kinds of diasporic writing. So when diasporic writers try to reveal real or imagined worlds, is it obliged to deal in broken mirrors, Rushdie says, some of whose fragments have been lost? Now, the different labels that have been attributed to Indian diasporic writing include neither here nor there, the Trishanku image from the mythic tale, the Des Pardes syndrome, etc. Further, diasporic writers have variously described themselves as migrants, plural, hybrid, expatriate, immigrant, every individual investing these words with personal and restrictive connotations. The alienated consciousness of the writer using the English language is an important factor here. But since the late 1970s and early 80s, after expatriation, immigration to the West, the trauma of uprooting, the diasporic consciousness, and the loss of home and identity have preoccupied many Indian writings in English. In order to do away with the false image of projecting India as a land of snake charmers and princes and elephants, they have started inscribing Indian words within the gloss without any glossary or italicization into the text with a vengeance, so to say. The relationship between East and West, both used for metaphors for different ways of life, have also been explored in the writing of most of these writers. Diasporic Indian writers in English have often been criticized for writing for the Western audience in mind, and with an eye towards bagging a Booker or a Commonwealth Writers Award, along with their astronomical advance amounts that they all seem to try out their luck in the Cinderella syndrome. As Bill Buford of the New York Times says, it shows publishers in the West that books by an Indian writer could sell. In understanding what motives the makers of literature, as Dr. Johnson knew, it pays to think about pay also, unquote. Now, I just want to, this is why I was just hopping, skipping, I told you, with a few ideas. And I have just 2 more points to make before I conclude. Do I have the time, Manju? 2 minutes?
1 minute.
2 minutes? Okay, it's enough. So the diaspora has perceptibly modified the original 4 primary zones of contact, which Vinay Dharwarkar in his famous essay, The Historical Formation of Indian English Literature, has said. Now, coming to the present context, and this is where I want to conclude it, we are gradually noticing a shift in the themes of the novels by Indian diasporic writers. The earlier ideas of cross-cultural encounters between the home culture and the newly adopted nation of an individual, these issues of acculturation seems to be passé now. And every second day, in every trip to the US, I find discussions about new writers, Indian diasporic writers, Neil Mukherjee, Akhil Sharma, Tishani Doshi, and many more debut novelists who are discussed a lot in the New York Times, etc. But somehow they fade into oblivion very soon. And coming to the more established writers of the Indian diaspora, the situation is quite interesting, and one notices a definite tectonic shift. Jhumpa Lahiri's last few books have nothing to do with the diaspora.
Tanya, please mute yourself.
After settling down in Rome, she is only writing about the use of language and even attempting to write in Italian. Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, she has completely shifted to narrating women-centric stories based on Indian mythology. And after having protagonists like Draupadi and Sita, she has now even shifted to narrating the historical character of Rani Jindan Kaur, the last queen of Punjab and wife of Raja Ranjit Singh, in her latest novel, which came out a couple of months back, The Last Queen. Amitava Ghosh, who from his very first novel had used transnational locations for his stories, did so very clearly even in his last novel, The Ghana Island, and though deeply concerned about climatic changes and global warming, he is still focused on the major issues of migration, both legal and illegal. Interestingly, his latest book, Jungle Nama, a graphic novel released just 3 days ago, on the 12th of February, narrates the story of the Sundarbans and the Bon Bibi mythology. So from these examples, I just want to place in front of you, it becomes clear that it will no longer be possible to label diasporic Indian English writers under one umbrella, as with the passage of time, they move to newer pastures and continue to market and sell their new books as a worthwhile commercial product. Thank you.
Thank you, Somdatta. Thank you for the very comprehensive paper, and you've raised a very valid question. Is the Des Pardes syndrome still valid? I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussion on it, but let us move on to Tanya Chakravarti now. Tanya Chakravarti, your paper, please. Unmute yourself.
Yes. I'm so sorry I got disconnected in the middle. Right. I wish to thank the Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on diasporic Indian English literature. And I also want to thank Professor Sangyukta Dasgupta. She was my teacher and supervisor, no longer teacher, but very much a mentor still. What I'll do is I will limit myself to examples of 3 women writers and their works set in the 1960s and 70s. And I'll be taking 2 to 3 perspectives. One is that of memory studies. I'll take the feminist perspective, and I'll also look at language and how it changes in the hands of the first and the second generation immigrants. As all the other speakers said before me, obviously migration becomes central to a study of literature of the diaspora. Post-colonial theorists pay attention to the real-life cartographic movement of peoples and migrants throughout the world. And Andrew Smith asserts, whatever older formations of identity were based in ancestry, passport, or geography, it is their apparent fixity that migrancy calls into question. So the diasporic individual, in Homi Bhabha's words, begins living on the borderline of history and language, on the limits of race and gender. So for migrants, there are always adaptations and constructions that lead to new insight, adaptation to changes, dislocations, and transformations. In fact, whether or not the migrations are by choice or compulsion, Leela Gandhi refers to mutual transformations that affect both the migrants as well as indigenous populations. Or in terms of post-colonial studies, the victimizers and victims. Now, why so much of immigration? Why are we talking of immigration? You see, after the Second World War, right from the 1950s, America emerged as the preferred destination for many Indian students and scholars, because a true sea change occurred under President Lyndon B. Johnson with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, officially enacted in 1968, which opened the gate for scientists, engineers, doctors, pharmacists, and other professionals, and later their closer relatives, to emigrate directly from India. Salman Rushdie, the name has been taken so many times, he opines that the immigrant, the man without frontiers, is an archetypal figure of our age. For immigrants, the anguish of being far from home, from the homelands, the memories of their homeland, and the pain and agony of having left everything behind remain. And the immigrant always attempts to assimilate, adapt, and amalgamate with the society of the new host country. Diasporic writing has a great significance pertaining to both countries and cultures, I would say. New individual identities negotiate boundaries, confines, and spatial metaphors. And diasporic writers also live on the margins of two countries. And for the first generation immigrants, there is proximation and assimilation. This is manifested in their desire for freedom and selfhood for themselves and their children. And later, the half-hearted loyalty of their children to Indian culture creates discords. Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta, in an essay, states that skilled middle-class professionals made a move from a known but deprived space. You can read that as Asia or India, to the unknown space of promised opportunities. Well, the US is a land, fabled land of opportunities. Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni's stories in her collections titled Arranged Marriage or The Unknown Errors of Our Lives, stories like Clothes, The Ultrasound, or Mrs. Datta Writes a Letter, these manifest that contrast. Both Bharati Mukherjee and Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni gave the protagonists a society that was repressive, traditional, caste-bound, genderist, so that they could discard it very easily. Bharati Mukherjee feels that Asian males are too preoccupied about economic transformation to change mentally. But she has more interesting things to say about women. She says, I quote, "The kinds of women who attract me, who intrigue me, are those who are adaptable. We have all been trained to please, trained to be adaptable as wives, and that adaptability is working to the women's advantage when we come over as immigrants. For an Indian woman to learn to drive, put on pants, cash checks is a big leap. They are exhilarated by that change." Well, we have to contextualize. Most of these stories are set in the 60s and 70s. When we were students in college or at the university in the 90s, yes, we wore pants and mostly pants. But in the 60s, yes, this was a big leap indeed. So the three novels of Bharati Mukherjee, namely Wife, Jasmine, and The Holder of the World, encompass these phases of expatriation, transition, and immigration. The question is, how do these writers show that transition? Writers very often use violence as a leitmotif. Violence and change become integral parts of the protagonist's life. And in Jasmine, for example, Mukherjee calls upon the Hindu religious belief in a reincarnation. She was asked whether she saw immigration as an experience of reincarnation, and she replied, "Absolutely. I've been murdered and reborn at least 3 times." Protagonists have successive rebirths, as it were, in one lifetime. This concept is beautifully juxtaposed with the shifting and multiple identity of the migrant post-colonial subject who will continue to reinvent herself in a desire to assimilate. Think of Devakaruni's stories like Clothes or The Blooming Season for Cacti, with actual killings and deaths, or stories like The Disappearance or The Ultrasound, where there are silent but violent protests by women. Now I will speak a little about memory and how I link the diasporic experience to cultural memory, social memory, and collective memory. According to Alon Confino, the notion of society is based on a linear concept of history developing forward along one temporal timeline. In contrast, he says, the notion of culture is based on a multi-temporal concept of history where past and present co-mingle and coalesce, privileging topics of representation and memory interpreted in terms of experience, negotiation, agency, and shifting relationship. So, when you have fresh construction and reinterpretation of the past, and this happens in diasporic communities, culture becomes intrinsically related to memory. When you talk about cultural memory, well, first generation immigrants are preoccupied with nostalgia. In keeping culture alive, humans create a temporal framework that transcends the individual lifespan, and this in turn relates past, present, and future. Think of Gogol's visit to Calcutta. Ashok tries to tell Gogol of his past and the Bengali heritage, how the Ganguly surname is a legacy of the British, anglicized way of pronouncing the real surname, Gangopadhyay, etc. So here, father and son participate in extended horizons of meaning production. Social memory, what is social memory? Harold Welser says the passing down of tradition, non-simultaneity, and the history of wishes and hopes form the subjective side of social memory. This is what we find also in immigrants. Diasporic writers show characters who try and preserve the social and cultural baggage. And what does it consist of? It consists of religion, language, music, art, dress, cuisine, etc., among other things. And they try to pass this culture and these traditions to the future generation. Mrs. Sen's, the story has come up in discussions before me. Here, Elliot watches Mrs. Sen as she chopped things seated on newspapers. Instead of a knife, she used a blade that curved like a prow of a Viking ship. I don't know what it is called in Hindi, but in Bengali, we refer to it as the boti. So nobody uses the boti in the West, but Mrs. Sen does. And she loves to have fish brought from the market. In the third and final continent, with his new bride Mala in the apartment, they eat with their hands. And later, the protagonist says that they drive to Cambridge to visit their son or bring him home for a weekend so that he can eat rice with us with his hands and speak in Bengali. In the namesake, Oshima continues to wear nothing but saris and sandals from Bata, something that Mrs. Lahiri, Jhumpa Lahiri's mother, did too. Lahiri wrote that I'm the daughter of a mother who would never change. And she talks about her strategy for resisting American culture, for fighting it, for maintaining her identity. And added to all this, you have collective memory. David Manier and William Hurst use the term collective memory to refer to representations of the past in the minds of members of a community that contribute to the community's sense of identity. So, in the writings of these diasporic writers, in their fiction, they create sites of memory in order to hold on to their Indianness, sometimes their Bengaliness. As stated already by speakers before me, by Professor Bandopadhyay, Professor Somdatta Mondol, yes, the attempts of adaptation and adjustment always comes with a concern to maintain the culture and identity of the homeland. And Rushdie opines that diasporic individuals are interested primarily, I quote, in the creative, recreative power of the imagination, rather the contingencies of the actual homeland, unquote. So women in their fiction manifest this, all these three women, Bharati Mukherjee, Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, and Jhumpa Lahiri. In Mrs. Sen, Eliot observes, when Mrs. Sen said home, she meant India, not the apartment where she sat chopping vegetables. And the creation of this imaginary homeland is also manifested in the dress codes. Now, the second generation children show reversal and resistance to the Indian way of life. Stories portray the generational and cultural conflict and lack of communication. One of the common reasons of discord include dating or having live-in relationships with American boys, where Asian American parents forget that the children are American too, without hyphenated identities like theirs. So talking about, this kind of freedom of the self, I would say that female sexuality also marks, in the words of Leslie Bow, ethnic or national betrayal. Particularly, as Bow says, sexuality mediates between progress and tradition, modernity and the old world, the United States and Asia. Stories by these Indian women diasporic writers reveal an Asian patriarchy which was pushed aside totally or subsumed by an American patriarchy. Women resist being cast as icons of national values or idealized custodians of tradition. Also among first generation immigrants, in Elika Boimer's words, in this case, Indian tradition. So Asian women benefited by the diminishment of traditional Asian or Indian patriarchal authority. Adrian Rich refers to two powerful pressures in present-day American culture. One is the imperative to assimilate, the other, the idea that one can be socially twice born. Rich says, to assimilate means to give up not only your history, but your body. So borrowing her words, we could say that these women choose to be disloyal to civilization. Do I have 2 to 3 more minutes?
Yes, another minute or so.
Okay. So since immigrants are bilingual and bicultural, immigrants sometimes feel that they belong neither to their homeland nor their adopted country. Or you may say that they are doubly loyal both to the homeland and to the adopted country. This dual identity or fractured identity becomes pronounced in the choice of language. Jhumpa Lahiri's non-fiction, in other words, portrays her, in her own words, as a kind of linguistic exile. My mother tongue, Bengali, is foreign in America, she says. When you live in a country where your own language is considered foreign, you can feel a continuous sense of estrangement. She refers to English as a stepmother. And her own experiences are painfully similar to the ones experienced by the children of immigrants portrayed in her fictional works. The children include Lilia, Gogol, Sonia, Moushumi, Usha, Kaushik. They could also say, as Jhumpa Lahiri herself does, Bengali will be taken away when my parents are no longer there. It's a language that they personify, that they embody. When they die, it will no longer be fundamental to my life. The suspension between linguistic worlds reminds us of the mythical Trishanku. The name has been taken already. Interestingly, Uma Parameswaran, the expatriate Indian writer settled in Canada, has a collection of poems titled Trishanku. So fiction penned by Indian women writers represents displacement, dispossession, relocation, hybridization, mongrelization, and a sense of loss of the Indian diasporic community. But we have to remember that at the moment, America is a world which is interracial and multicultural, as it has always been. So the conflicts, they keep on changing from generation to generation. In a nation of immigrants, there is always a self that is assimilated. But as Shirley Gyork Lin Lim says, there is the self that refuses to be assimilated. She uses the term unassimilatable. And America, which has had an inevitable shift from a white majority nation to a multi-ethnic nation, also continues to evolve. So the characters, as well as the nation state, continue to evolve, always becoming, never being or acquiring a fixed identity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. So we've had these 6 papers presented before us. And Amit, will you switch on your video, please? Debashish is back here. Amit, please switch on your video. Yeah. So a number of points have been put forward, but before I briefly sum up the papers, I would like to point out that whenever we talk about diaspora and diasporic writing from India, we have been talking about it for the last 25 years at least. There are certain buzzwords that keep coming up, buzzwords like hyphenated, binaries, the sense of loss, memory, fragmentation, hybridity, marginality, rootedness, dislocation, acculturation, assimilation, exile, sense of loss, in-betweenness, migrant, and expatriate. So these are the words that keep coming up again and again. And they have been coming for the last at least almost 3 decades. True, we can go back to Deen Muhammad, but the study of diasporic Indian writing has been received its impetus mainly in the 1990s. And I remember that collection of essays that Somdatta Mandal brought out in 2 volumes, and that was really a monumental task. That came out almost 20 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, looking at the papers, we saw that Amit talked about Arjun Appadurai's concept, and so did Debashish, but they referred to different writers. One referred to Rabindranath Tagore, and in a manner that was very different from Amit's. And then we had Kalpana, who talked about women writers in Canada. She began with Uma Parameshwaram and Anita Badami Rao, who are well-established, so to speak, diasporic writers. But then she talked about contemporary young writers also, Rupi Kaur and Vivek Shraya. Julie spoke about Sri Lankan Canadian fiction, and she brought in food and language as tropes, pointing out that these writers live in 2 worlds. So she talked about the foodscapes and the linguascapes of diasporic writing. And then we had Somdatta, who raised a very valid question: is the Desh Pardesh syndrome still valid? I'm sure this will garner a lot of discussion out here. And Tanya, finally, who spoke about culture, memory, language, and she talked about how the first generation of immigrants is different in approach to the second. Now, let us see if there are any questions that come up now. May we take up Amit's? Amit, you're still here? Amit is still here.
He just entered the cab. So
yeah, he's just entered the cab. So maybe we can discuss, Amit, any questions related to Amit's paper at this point? Would you have any questions related to Amit's paper?
I just have a compliment, Chair.
There is no audience, and there are no questions on the Q&A or the chat box, so we have to carry on the discussion. Yes, Julie?
I thought, Professor Jakka, that his invocation to Pico Iyer's essay in Time magazine, The Empire Strikes Back, was very pointed and very useful, because it opened the gates to what he was going to discuss about ethnoscape and idioscape and how they can coexist and do coexist. So we have used, as Raja Rao had said, I think in way back in 36, that we have our own voices, but we must use the language of the colonial master to tell our stories in our voices. So I think, you know, if you conflate 1936 to Arjun Appadurai's globalization ideas of disjuncture, you have a wonderful explication that Amit had done. And then I think Professor Debashish Bandyopadhyay continued with Tagore, linking the Ghore Baire idea of both, how both can talk and speak to the idea of home.
Would you have anything specific to ask Amit before he finally boards his plane and zooms off?
Not really. It was just something that I thought was very well done, that he invoked Empire Strikes Back. And, you know, that whole Bill Ashcroft and Helen Tiffin and that whole slew of earlier post-colonial critics.
Right.
Okay, now we have been talking about the Empire Striking Back, and we have been talking about Arjun Appadurai for the last 30 years. For the last 30 years. Huh? And I was just wondering if we have to be stuck at Arjun Appadurai and the Empire Striking Back. Can we move forward?
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So basically that, so Professor Somdatta referred, okay, she used the word tectonic shift. Okay. She also mentions very recent authors. If we take US and England, only two places, there is absolutely zero reference to their native places, like Akshaya Raman and Deepthi. They are all wonderful young writers, or 90s kids or 2K kids. They're amazing writers. They write English. But I mean, like Tanya was referring to these, even this cultural memory changes. I mean, what gets passed on is something amazing. I mean, like he mentioned, but maybe, as your point is very valid, should we get stuck there only? Or
No, we have 20 minutes left. Huh?
yeah,
We have
17
20 minutes left, and let us not simply get rooted with rootedness and unrootedness, uprootedness, and so on. Let us think of the way ahead. So
Yes,
if you have, yes, Debashish, you have something to say?
In fact, when you speak about Appadurai as quite dated, dated means that he is 30 years old. But in fact, 30 years before, he had raised some very fundamental questions about the kind of diasporic sensitivities changing because of technologies and mediascapes, which we had been talking about in this particular platform. For example, the question of how memory works in contradistinction to the kind of mediascapes or representations in this digital world. A person who had been living in the US as a diasporic person from India for the last 30 years is no longer dependent upon his memory of what had happened 30 years before, as much as he is dependent upon the epistemic violences that take place because of the kind of discursive media representations. And this media is very digital and very electronic. It can be Instagrams, it can be Twitters, it can be print medias, it can be television, it can be Hindi films of the present day, it can be a film like Parzania of a particular massacre that took place.
Please summarize, Debashish, so that we can move on to Julie.
Right. So naturally, Appadurai's notions are still very valid, given the kind of what he called initiation into the project or the historic future that is going to take place some 50 years later.
Julie, what do you have to say to that?
Professor Jakka, I think you made a wonderful point, which again moves me to very quickly talk about the problematics that the writers in the diaspora face. And I'm talking Judy Fong Bates, who's Canadian Chinese. I'm talking about a writer of, a celebrity writer like Joy Kogawa, who's a Japanese Canadian. And they talk about the pockmarked history of Canadian immigration, very well read all over the world. Now, the point I want to make to you all is that although they might want to move away from cultural paradigmatic geographies, it is an industry which the publishing world is living on. And
what is the industry? Diasporic literature, or what is the industry?
Yes. What I'm saying is that the publisher, when he gives the writer a mandate from the diaspora, Asian diaspora is what I know, so I can only speak about that. They don't want to know about the Canadian experience and diasporic Asian writer has. They want the exotic. So there is a constant push to the diasporic writer to
You say they want the exotic. You say they
Yes.
want the exotic. I do not agree with that, but let me go on to the others. Kalpana, quickly, in 2 minutes, tell me what do you have to say. Unmute, please unmute. Unmute, Kalpana.
I said that I've taken less time to read the paper, so I should be given little time. No, I was just joking. It's nothing to do with that.
We have 14 minutes left.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll just take the 2 minutes. Don't worry. No, I just had the point that, to some extent, when we were looking at the writers, as you said, where there's no cultural memory, the point is that, they might want to, I might use a word like saying unhoming, they do not want to have any kind of quotation about a home because they don't seem to have one. They are more bothered with the reality of the existence in which they are living. But there's also a problem because you see, when we construct nations are constructed with a kind of idea of gender, of a kind of background. And when you place these writers, as I think Somdatta very correctly said, that they become in some way commercialized. And I think that's what was the point Julie was making.
Yes.
That, there is a fabrication that is going on. They do not want to be there, but they are also forced to be there.
It's been going on since Bharati Mukherjee's time. It's been going on since Bharati Mukherjee's time.
Yes, but I think in the later writers, it gets worse because, they really do not even bother to talk about the homeland here.
Tanya, what do you have to say?
Yeah, I would say that, yes, as you said, with her, in the last 30 years, I mean, there has been increased globalization, more of communication. And especially in a world where we have FaceTime calls and WhatsApp calls where you can actually connect so easily. I mean, that sense of nostalgia of having left something behind, that does not remain at all. So, and as I said, in the course of my paper, the switch from sari to pants was a big leap. But here we are so used to, wearing Western clothes and looking constantly at what is, common in the East, also in the West. I mean, I remember our own childhoods, Chitrahar once in a week. It was a different world then in India. But now, of course, the American teenager and the Indian teenager, they're not too different, if you think of it that way. So that sense of having left so much of tradition behind, that does not remain at all.
Somdatta, your point of view?
I repeatedly say the same thing, that we cannot go on discussing the old novels, old texts of these writers and keep on labeling them as diasporic and give examples from them when they themselves have shifted a lot to a newer kind of writing.
We cannot go flogging a dead horse.
Yes.
And diaspora is a dead horse. Why? Because we are living in a world that has come together. We are living in what has been called by Thomas Friedman a flat world. Even if you disagree with Friedman, you cannot deny that you are connected all the time, connected. You are connected with your children who are in the US, who are in Japan, who are in other places.
So there is a full stop.
You know exactly what is happening when the White House is vandalized by people, and they know what is happening here. Twitter, Instagram, everything. So where does nostalgia and memory and the sense of exile come in? It comes in only for performance. You said something about performance. Yes. A writer who is commercial, so to speak.
Yes, you have to sell your product.
Yes.
So you have to think about new use.
Can I just jump in for 1 minute, yes. Prof. Jakka? The point that I would like to bring all the strands together in our agreements and disagreements about the exilic and the exotic. I think one way to look at it is the pressure that is put, and I can't get away from this enough. I agree with Professor Mondal that we should get away from it and forge new paths and trailblaze, but the ultimate act of success for a writer is the readership. And the Western readership still wants to know about what is
don't agree.
I don't agree with you.
Speak to the publishers, speak to the publishers and the writers.
They wanted it in Bharati Mukherjee's time, and that is why they had India full of snake charmers and maharajas.
Yeah, but
and
it's not that.
So on.
I think there's more to India than snake charmers. They've realized that.
The world has just moved on. And plus, don't forget, the world has been brought together by nothing other than COVID, coronavirus. So our experiences, at least over the last year and a half, are similar. We have come together. So it's not like looking back. If you look back, it is all fake. That's what I would say. It is all fake. And then come to think of it, who are the people, who are the diasporic writers who write? Not the techies, not the people who are busy in corporate houses abroad. The people who write are people who are into literature. It's a small section of diasporic people who write. So they are not really representative of the other major part of the section, which is busy making money, right? And then you see, it becomes very nostalgic and very kind of romantic to say, I'm in exile and I've left my country behind. But don't forget it, you are making good money, jolly good money out there. And then don't forget it, it's a choice. We talked about choice. It's a choice that they have made and gone there. So let us rip off this false facade that covers diasporic writing and let us see it for what it really is. The younger generation has moved away. If Jhampa Lahiri writes about India, what does she know about India? She knows about it only secondhand through her mother, grandmother, and whatever. And it's commercially, it's a viable project, so she writes about it. Now, why do we have to hang on to people like Appadurai and all that Jing Bang lot? We have been doing it for the last 30 years. When we are in a position to think, we have our own minds, we have our own thinkers, we have our own point of view, our own philosophies. Where I was waiting for somebody to mention the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Why hasn't that come up? I mean, the philosophy of India, and I'm not talking about Hindutva, I'm not talking about any narrow fanaticism or whatever. I'm talking about the larger ideal of the world as a whole. I'm talking about Ubuntu. Why don't we bring that into our conversations?
Yes, that is exactly what I've been doing, because I did not read Rabindranath Tagore's Sadhana in this particular platform. Tagore did that way back in the first decade.
You can see the top of your head, Debashish.
Oh, I'm moving closer to the microphone. So that was exactly the point of the paper that I've been writing.
That is what we need to do.
Right.
Well, we have 6 minutes more and we can have a quick round. Kalpana? No, unmute yourself, please.
I just wanted to add to this one point that you made about, there's so many people who are away and they're not writing, who are techies and corporates and things like that. But I also wanted you to think about the fact that many of these people are bringing culture back into their homes through blog sites and various kinds of festivities, because you see, I know that a large number of them bring
many of them are living abroad, making good money, and they have neglected the older generation, they have neglected their parents, but when the parents die, they are the first to come back and claim as their inheritance.
No, but they still use, you see, a lot of blog sites to talk about festivals, rituals. So that is what is also important. We have to look at that also.
Can I just add a sentence, Manju?
Yes.
I just want to say, I think we should stop labeling diasporic writers.
Yes.
It's high time we stopped the labeling. Writers are writers. Like recently, Amitabh Ghosh was in Calcutta in many of the seminars, and I was listening to some of his webinars, and he was questioned about many stupid things that he wrote in Gun Island and how is it. And one thing he went on over and over again saying is, we are concerned about global warming. We are concerned about that. The issues he had, brought up in the Great Derangement, climatic change and all, and migration voluntarily or involuntarily in some of the characters moving from here And then, so all these issues are what is mainly concerned now. And it is not the responsibility of a writer to go on saying, because I'm living abroad, I have to write about India. I have to write or represent my country. So
There
this is a
are no
question.
walls. There are no walls anymore.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. Already his stories were transnational, located in 3-4 different continents at the same time, hopping, skipping, jumping.
I mean, if Rabindranath went abroad and then he talked about Urbana, I went to Urbana. I've been there several times. I did not see anybody talking about his visit to Urbana. But for that matter, Somdatta has been abroad so many times and she writes. Does that make her a diasporic writer? Does that make her a diasporic writer? So how much do we stretch this term and why should we stretch this term?
It's enough. That is what I said. This tectonic shift has arrived. Writers are writers. Books are products to be, sold. Everyone wants their books to be sold. And keeping in mind certain myths, exotica, we all talk about Divakaruni here so much, Bharati Mukherjee. I was asking some of the professors of various universities. Some of them hadn't even heard her name. South Asian writing courses. When I said, who is this lady? I said, she's written 16 books. Well, we don't know anything about it. So it's a misnomer that, I think we should stop.
We should stop.
Yes, but we should stop.
Yes.
And we should look as writers, whether they live 6 months like Amitabh Ghosh in Brooklyn and 6 months in Goa and 6 months in Calcutta. It makes no difference.
The thing is, in the beginning, they got a very good platform. When Salman Rushdie brought out his vintage book, this Mirror Works, remember?
Yes, yes.
Out of the entire list of contributors, 75% of those were settled abroad.
Yes.
As if Indian writers were all dead and forgotten and buried and whatever, right? So you get a platform and then you make full use of it. I guess we would also do that, if we got a chance. But let us see things with the way they are.
30 years is a long time.
Absolutely.
Diaspora is a dead horse.
Yes. So we need to move on. We need to find other issues. And well, I'm sure we can come up with other ideas, other ways of looking at literature and treat the diasporic writer as some kind of an old fossil, dinosaur or one of those creatures that we need to study once in a while. And well, it's been a great panel. I must tell you, I'm working for Shulini University. I've got 2 minutes now. I'm working for Shulini University, and every Friday we have a literary program, which is called Belletristic. If you would like to join in one of our sessions, it would be very nice. Send me an email. I'll put you on the mailing list, and maybe you can be a speaker sometimes.
Yeah, that is really wonderful. That's wonderful. I hope people who are watching this program do write to you, Professor Manju. So it has been a very fascinating evening, afternoon. So we had such a lively discussion, and I thank personally every one of you, Professor Manju Jakka, Professor Somdatta, Dr. Chane Chakravarti, Professor Kalpana, Dr. Debashish, Dr. Julie, and Amit. So all of you, and for those who are watching, in fact, this kind of discussion brings up a lot of things like, actually, this is a wonderful thing. Maybe it just came up, it popped up in my brain that in Indian literature, in Indian languages, the voices of the people who are returning from abroad has been captured. I don't know, not many people would have paid attention. For example, in Tamil, you have a few stories of Pudumai Pithan, and Malayalam is God, Telugu, Satyavati has written Nenavuru, in Marathi, that Kanitkar. So in almost all languages I have seen, maybe we should have a program, exactly something very related to this, but not on there. We can do away with this diaspora and
the return of the prodigal.
Yes, something like that. And like Tanya's when she was telling, in fact, many people refer to the word culture, and it's very fascinating to see that there are many multi-dimensional understanding. And for example, how a physical event leads to forms of memory. that leads to a metaphor, and that in turn leads to another physical event. So this is, I mean, it's a very fascinating thing how it's captured in literature. So that's for another day we can discuss. And thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.